Now, last week, Australia's intelligence organisations added a UK-based neo-Nazi group, Sonnenkrieg Division is their name, to a list of 26 prescribed terrorist organisations in this country. Now, their ABC, and of course the Malcolm Turnbull-financed Guardian website, had a field day claiming it was the first right-wing terror organisation listed in Australia. Well, both missed the point that National Socialism, as is in the name, the ideology behind the Nazis, is like all other forms of socialism. It is poison of the political left. Now, the decision by our security agencies was also seized upon by Labor, who are desperately looking for another mallet to club the government with.
This is a problem that has been a growing national security threat. ASIO has been upfront with the community to say that this is a serious national security threat. And yet Scott Morrison and Peter Dutton have downplayed, dismissed and sought to ignore this growing national security threat.
Now, I've got to admit I'm unaware of the risk to Australia from the crazies involved in Sonnenkrieg Division, but it did give me cause to view the other 25 prescribed groups on the terrorist watch list. And it's interesting to note that all of them are linked to fundamentalist Islam, including some with the non-state that Labor now recognise as part of its platform. That's Palestine. Now, I can only guess that based on the security assessments, the threat from Islamic fundamentalists is somewhat greater than that from National Socialists in this country. And although it is a world away, we were reminded of this recently with shocking images of more than 50 people beheaded by Islamic State militants in the town of Palma, which is in Mozambique, just a couple of weeks ago. Now, earlier today, I was joined by the former military intelligence officer, Professor Clive Williams, to talk about the threat of terrorism in this country. Professor Clive Williams, thanks so much for your time tonight. A lot has been made about, by the left of the political spectrum, about the prescribing of the Sonnenkrieg Division and saying that, you know, right-wing or white supremacist movements around the world are really a serious terrorist threat. Are they over-egging the pudding, or is there a genuine threat to mainstream society from these organisations?
Well, there's a variety of different extreme right-wing groups. Some of them are white supremacist groups, others are neo-Nazis, some are just fight clubs, and not many of them actually advocate or engage in terrorism. But the Sonnenkrieg Division is different in the sense that it has been encouraging people who are interested in it to engage in terrorist acts, so therefore it falls within the Australian legislation.
Yes, and we want our security forces, of course, to keep us safe, but it seems to me it's a very long way away in the UK, and we don't have the same sort of organised movements here in Australia. Is that an accurate depiction, or is there the embryonic growth of these sorts of extreme movements here as well?
I think with a lot of these groups, be it Proud Boys in America, The Base, Sonnenkrieg, National Action and so on, quite often they reach out from overseas, and sometimes they end up having a group in Australia like National Action did. So it can spread, and of course the ideology can be spread. And of course, you know, Islamic State and Al Qaeda are good examples of organisations that are not in Australia but spread their ideology to Australia and have created problems for us.
Yes, and we've learned that to our regret. Can I just ask you about the reference you just made there? I know a lot of our viewers would view the Proud Boys as very, very different to, say, the Sonnenkrieg Division. Why did you include them in that assessment of these sorts of radical groups?
Well, they are listed as a terrorist organisation by Canada. Canada has listed 5 extreme right-wing groups as terrorist organisations, but then their criteria are a bit different to Australia's. The Americans tend not to list extreme right-wing groups as terrorist organisations because of course, Donald Trump had embraced them to some extent and sees them as ultra-patriots. So it's quite difficult, I think, in America to designate a right-wing group as a terrorist organization, although Canada has a problem with some of these groups spilling over the border and has not been prepared to allow them to continue like that. And so they have listed them as terrorist organizations.
Yeah, it's in Australia here. I mean, I was going through the prescribed organisations. There are now 26 on the list. 25 of them are built around Islamic extremist movements. The names that will be familiar to many of our viewers tonight: Al Qaeda, Al-Shabaab, the Palestinian Liberation Organisation. I beg your pardon, not that one in particular, but the Palestinian Islamic Jihad. You've got a range of other organisations like Hezbollah and so forth. Is militant Islamic terrorism still the threat that historically many of us have perceived it to be?
Well, it's still a threat, but I would say that a lot of those groups don't need to be on the Australian list. I think there's an advantage in actually having a smaller list and focusing on fewer organisations. And, there's a great many like Al-Shabaab, for example, which certainly would kidnap an Australian if it had the opportunity, but so would many other groups. And I think that, it doesn't really need to be on there. The PKK, the Kurdistan Workers' Party, is a separatist organisation. It's never killed any Australians. It doesn't really need to be in there. I was told that it was on the list because it pleased Turkey for us to put it there, and we'd need access to Gallipoli. So that might be there for political reasons rather than because it poses any threat to Australia. So I think there's scope for refining the list. Other countries do have much longer and bigger lists, but there's no real advantage in that, I don't think.
Well, Professor, what are the essential criteria that means you get on the list or you don't? Is it about being a threat to Australia or a threat to Australians abroad, or is it more political than that, as you've just pointed out with the Kurdistan Workers' Party?
Well, the legislative requirement is that it has to be a group which is advocating or encouraging a terrorist act. And of course, that would limit the number of organisations that you would consider. And that's why our list, I guess, is down to 26, although I'd have to say that many of those groups within that 26 don't, in my view anyway, advocate terrorist acts against Australia. So I think the list could certainly be culled down. But there's also a non-legislative aspect to it, which includes things like posing threats to Australian interests. So therefore, maybe a group that poses a threat to Australians in the Philippines might be included. But I think that the non-legislative aspects should be given more weight, because I think at the moment it's the list is a bit skewed and is not really balanced in terms of what is a threat to Australians both within Australia and overseas.
Yes, and it's easy in this time of COVID where there's lockdowns and limited travel and we're all focused on fighting the pandemic to think that terrorism is a thing of yesteryear, but it was only a couple of weeks ago that 50 people were beheaded in Mozambique. It's a stark reminder that these ideological nutcases or zealots really will never miss an opportunity given the chance. How protective has the travel restrictions meant that Australia has been immune to perhaps other threats of terrorism over the last year or so?
I think it's been extremely beneficial because, the fact that there aren't so many Australians vulnerable at the moment, both overseas and within Australia, I think is beneficial, because we don't have crowds very often at the moment. That's sort of been a protective factor. But the thing is that Islamic State and Al Qaeda haven't gone away. They're simply been biding their time and preparing for the time when they can become more active again. And of course, they've also been very pleased with what's happening in the United States. The fact that the US has lost so many people, they almost see COVID-19 as being a warrior for themselves. So, they're pleased with the way things are going. But this has given them a period where they could actually start to regenerate. And I think next year we'll see a resurgence of terrorism again.
Well, Professor Clive Williams, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us tonight. They're words of wisdom, and we've always got to beware and looking for the future. So thanks so much again.
My pleasure, Corey.